Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo. And it's great to be with you today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Got a great show in store for you today. We're going to have our good friend John DeRosa come into the dojo, and we're going to talk about proofs for the existence of God. But, we're going to take a different take on it, though, because which proofs are the best to use? Which ones most clearly demonstrate the existence of God? Many of us, as Catholics, we're familiar with Aquinas' 5 ways, but do you know that there's actually a lot of other arguments out there for the existence of God? Well, I can think of no better person to come into the dojo to help us, kind of take a survey of that than John DeRosa, who is the classical theist. He has a website called classicaltheism.com, and he interviews some of the best in all areas of apologetics, but I think he does his best work in theistic apologetics. So he's going to be coming on. It's going to be fun. It's always fun to have John in the dojo. Let's see. Also, as always, we're going to have our critical thinking skills and with our Finding the Fallacy segment. And I think we're going to switch it up this week. I think this week I'm going to do nothing but propaganda techniques. And instead of the informal fallacies, just to, change things up. It's always good, in exercising in that to change your routine. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at a propaganda technique, which I coined. I don't know if there's actually an official title, but I've encountered it a lot. It's called Defining Opposition Out of Existence. And we're also going to meet an early church father, and because early church fathers are very important. I explained defending faith. Why? Well, because they witnessed to the original beliefs of the first Christians. And today's early father is a great early father, and none other than Basil the Great. So we're going to talk about him as well. So got lots of great stuff in store for you. And as always, you are part of the program. So if you could, give us a call. If you have any questions when John is on the program, give us a call at 888-526-2151. That's 888-526-2151. Love to hear from you. Also, you can send your questions to questions@handsonapologetics.com. And by the way, they all come directly to the Sensei's mailbox, the dojo mailbox. And I do respond to them. I might not be very quick, but I do respond to each and every email. And even sometimes we do a show, and they're starting to pile up. So, we're getting to the point where perhaps we have enough letters that maybe in the next week or two we'll do a dojo mailbox show. That'll be a lot of fun. And also I want to give my traditional hat tip to all those watching social media, namely on Facebook and YouTube. Hello, everybody. Welcome aboard. It's great to see familiar names there. And I also want to welcome all of you across the country and overseas that are listening to Virgin Most Powerful Radio Network. Greetings, and, why don't we jump into our exercises? Like I said, the Finding the Fallacy is actually a propaganda technique, and the propaganda technique, by the way, is called Defining Opposition Out of Existence. How does this work? Well, by restricting the field of allowable evidence, a person can essentially define all opposition out of existence and thereby make it impossible for them to prove their argument wrong. Okay? Think about that. That's an interesting point. So it's impossible to falsify their position. Now, this doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen out there, so you need to be aware of it. I first encountered it when I was talking to a fundamentalist Baptist several years ago. And it's actually funny now that I think about it, but we're talking about sacred tradition oral tradition, if you will, unwritten tradition. And he demanded, show me in the Bible an oral tradition, an authoritative oral tradition. So I said, fine, I could show you a few. So I showed him a few. And he said, no, that's not an oral tradition. That's written in the Bible. That's why it's authoritative, because it's in Scripture. I said, show me an oral tradition. Well, if you think about it, what he was actually asking me to do was to show him in writing an unwritten tradition, which, of course, is impossible. You can't. So by him restricting the evidence only to what's found on the written page, he's effectively defined out of existence any possibility of showing that, no, the Jews believed in this, there's a body of teaching that was not consigned to writing, or even Christians, oral instructions that were not assigned to writing. And so that's where I first encountered it. By the way, you also encounter this amongst the new atheists as well. For example, they might say, show me scientific evidence. Now, by that they mean material evidence of a non-material being or something supernatural, which, of course, is like saying, show me something in nature that is not intrinsically part of nature or is beyond nature. Of course, that's about as easy as showing an unwritten tradition that's written in Scripture. You can't do it, folks. So that's our finding the fallacy for today. It's actually kind of a fun one, the finding the fallacy, actually the propaganda technique of defining opposition out of existence. All right, so let's turn our attentions now to Meet the Early Church Father. We meet one early church father every episode. Today, like I said, it's a great one, namely Basil the Great. Basil was born roughly around AD 330, died January 1st, 379 AD. He has the three great lights that are often referred to as the three Cappadocian fathers are Basil the Great of Caesarea, his friend Gregory of Nazianzus, and his brother Gregory of Nyssa. Basil was born about 330, like I said, in Caesarea in Cappadocia, to an illustrious family. His father, Basil, was the son of Saint Macrina the Elder, a zealous pupil of Gregory the Wonder Worker. His mother, Emelina, was the daughter of a martyr, and of the 10 children the family had, 3 of them that became bishops. Can you imagine that? So big families, produce clergy. 3 bishops. Basil himself was made bishop of Caesarea in 370. Gregory became the bishop of Nyssa, and Peter became the bishop of Sebaste. So the oldest daughter, Saint Macrina the Younger, was also a model of ascetical life. As a student in Athens, Basil first met Gregory of Nazianzus, joining him in fellowship so close that in his eulogy to Basil in 381, Gregory described them as one soul with 2 bodies. Soon after his baptism, which was postponed till his adult years, Basil sought the more perfect way of life, journeying to Egypt and the Middle East, inspecting various ascetical practices. He finally, upon coming home, he met Eustathius of Sebaste, who seemed to Basil to have discovered already what he himself was searching and longing for. The history of Basil is one of conflicts, especially with the heresy of Arianism, and also in all its different forms, and also a heresy of, let's see if I can say this, pneumomachianism. That's quite a word. Namely, it was a heretical sect that denied the divinity of the Holy Spirit. It would be a great word, by the way, to use in Scrabble. Around the time of the Emperor Valens, Basil was virtually the only Orthodox bishop in all the East who succeeded in retaining his see. And he did it by sheer force of character, combined with the courage to withstand the emperor when needful and to ignore him when practical. This was a period when throughout the world, now we're reading, of course, from Jurgen's Faith of the Early Fathers, Jurgens notes that at this time throughout the world, the Orthodox bishops who remained in charge of the churches could be counted on one's fingers, probably the fingers of one hand. So it was a very dark day in the church. Ask a Catholic today, and again, this is Jurgens talking, ask a Catholic today what the greatest tragedy ever to befall Christ's church was, and he'll probably reply that it was the Reformation in the 16th century, which has so rent the seamless robe that its schism is still with us. But the historian knows that it is in own time Arianism was far more general than Protestantism ever had been. And it is no small importance for the modern man that a knowledge of history of Arianism should demonstrate at least that the Catholic Church takes no account of popularity or numbers in shaping and maintaining doctrine. Else we should have long ago abandoned Basil, Hilary, and Athanasius and called ourselves Arian. So, saints like Athanasius, Hilary, Basil the Great, they were the ones that weathered the storm, and they're pillars of the Orthodox faith. By the way, Basil is also counted as the founder of Eastern monasticism, and with John Chrysostom, he is one of the two pillars of the Eastern Church. So, like I said, we have today a great early church father, namely Basil the Great. So that's Meet the Early Church Father for today. Coming up on the other side of the break, we're going to talk with Master Apologist John DeRosa about this surveying the proofs for the existence of God. What are the best arguments for the existence of God, and all such matters. Stay tuned. It's going to be a lot of fun, and we'll be right back right after this.
Welcome to our January 11th, 2020 Spiritual Warfare Conference. Every year without fail, this is our most popular, well-attended event. This year's Spiritual Warfare Conference will host Adam Bly, a Catholic demonologist, and an auxiliary member of the International Association of Exorcists, along with Dr. Luis Sandoval, a psychiatrist who's part of the Healing, Deliverance, and Exorcism team for the Diocese of Orange. These two gentlemen bring tons of experience and expertise in the area of spiritual warfare. This is going to be a high-information Catholic seminar. I'll be there as well, sharing some riveting stories on the diabolical and liberation found through Jesus Christ from my best-selling book, The Devil in the City of Angels. Mark your calendars, come and join us, and meet other radio hosts from Jesus 911. Contrary to popular belief, spiritual warfare is not demon-centered, it's Christ-centered. Come join us and learn how to armor up and fight the good fight of faith. Catholics, wake up. Don't hit the snooze button. Join us at St. Christopher Catholic Church, 629 South Glendora Avenue, West Covina, California, on January 11, 2020. See you then. Strength and honor in Jesus' name.
Jesus said in Matthew 26, "Stay awake and pray that you may not enter into temptation." According to St. Ephrem, Jesus, who feared nothing, experienced fear and asked to be freed from death, although he knew it was impossible. How much more must we persevere in prayer before temptation assails us, so that we may be freed when the test has come? May God grant that we may withstand temptation and carry out His will in all things.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. Proofs for existence of God. Are there only 1 or 5 proofs? How many different kinds of proofs are there? Maybe even what are the best proofs for the existence of God? Those are the questions we're going to explore, and to help us do that, we have the classical theist himself from classicaltheism.com, John DeRosa. John received an undergraduate degree in math education from the College of New Jersey and an MA in pure and applied mathematics from Montclair State University, and he is the master of the website classicaltheism.com, which has all sorts of great stuff, not only on classical theism, but also Christian apologetics and Catholic apologetics. And John, welcome to Hands on Apologetics.
Gary Machuda, it's great to be back and talking with you today.
Yeah, well, it's always a joy. Always a joy. Yeah, and like I said, you have. I was just looking at your list of podcasts come before the broadcast, and man, you have been busy.
Oh, it's been a ton of fun. You know, as we talk, we share guests, we talk to the best experts, and I like to pitch it. We're studious amateurs at the Classical Theism Podcast, and I just had a guy on, most relevant to today's show. He's teaching a graduate seminar in arguments for God's existence. And I'm like, how many people on the street even know such a thing exists? That there's people at the doctoral level doing research and teaching classes about arguments for God's existence. So it's really been a lot of fun to connect to. That expert was Dr. Robert Coons, who I'll mention, and a lot of the other great guests too. We just had Jimmy Aiken on. It's been a ton of fun.
Yeah, and you're doing great work. And, you know, I really appreciate that, because I believe that, you know, with the birth of the new atheism, it kind of caught Catholic apologists off guard, and there really isn't a lot of great material on the web that people can access, like amateurs, like you said, and kind of learn, you know, what are the proofs for God? How do you answer objections?
Absolutely. And I say, and I wouldn't just call, you know, us amateurs, I would say studious amateurs, because like you said, we're folks who are interested in apologetics. Maybe we started out doing, you know, Catholic and non-Catholic Christian apologetics, but then we realized the whole wave of atheism and secularism and skepticism that's coming our way, and we have to have some good answers. So we're interested in studying the material, and I'm just trying to get the content out there with great guests on the show, like you said. And you have a lot of the great guests as well. Carlo Broussard, we've been sharing ideas, and I'm looking forward to discussing some of the best arguments today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, first, you know, I think the first question for people would be, we're probably familiar with Aquinas' 5 ways. And for a lot of people, they think that's it. That's pretty much all we can do is those 5 ways, and there's no other way we could argue for God's existence. Is that true?
That's a great question. I think I'd have to do a little survey. The statistician in me kind of wants to maybe draw up a little survey, you know, get a random sample and see, hey, what do you think people have on offer for God's existence? I think people who have been in a history class or intro to philosophy class, they've heard Aquinas' 5 ways referenced. I mean, I remember back in college, our textbook for apologetics was by Peter Kreeft and Father Ronald Ticelli, Handbook of Catholic Apologetics, and they famously list 20 arguments in their chapter on God's existence. Alvin Plantinga has a famous lecture, 24 or so arguments for God's existence, which modern philosophers have taken and put into a book. People have given other lists and so forth. But, I think Aquinas definitely is enshrined as the most famous in Catholic circles. But one thing we can all do in conversation with a skeptic or an atheist is ask the question I've mentioned on your show before, but I think it's worth mentioning again. I call it the Trent Horn question because I learned it from him. When you're in a conversation with somebody who says, there's no evidence for God's existence, if you just show me that God was real, I would believe, but there's no evidence. It's just fairy tales. I've never seen anything. The question you need to ask them is, hey, well, what's some of the best evidence you've heard for God's existence, and what do you think is wrong with it? That way you can find out what this person has studied. Because as you said, some people were convinced by the overwhelming emotional appeal of the new atheists. Their confidence was strong. They declared that they love science, which as Catholics, we love science too. But, just that bravado came off and might have bulldozed a lot of people who were like, wow, I guess there really isn't any evidence for religion. So, but before I roll out, Peter Kreeft's 20 arguments, Aquinas' 5 ways, and so forth, I want to just ask this person, hey, what's the best evidence you've considered, and what do you think is wrong with it? Because if they've never heard anything, they might just be pleasantly and happily surprised to know that things like this exist.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people hear through secondary sources. They might have encountered Aquinas' 5 ways from, one of the new atheists, which generally, it would be bare bones, if that, and usually kind of misconstrues what the arguments are. And they say, well, if that's the best that theists can come up with, then, this is all easy to debunk.
Sure. Well, and that's the other thing that Trent Horton question allows you to do. Yeah. And again, I'll just briefly, but if you say, hey, what's the best evidence you've heard and what do you think is wrong with it? Then not only do they have to give you, a list of some ideas that they've heard, they're also therefore asked to call to mind the mistakes that they think the argument makes. And that gives you a chance to see, have they heard a good presentation of this, or are they just setting up a straw man? Because a lot of people, as you've indicated, have only heard maybe a very crude version of Aquinas' 5 ways. Dr. Edward Fazer, who's discussed Aquinas' 5 ways at length, he even admits when he was teaching intro to philosophy classes as an atheist, he used to just line up these proofs and just shoot them down like fish in a barrel, giving a very superficial level reading. And then over years and years of investigating and hearing and seeing better presentations of them, he became more convinced of the argument. So that's just another thing that question allows you to do, is see what they've studied and then detect if they've only heard straw men.
Yeah, and what's also freeing about that, I know probably people are listening to us and they're thinking, oh, I don't know philosophy. I don't know all these details and stuff. But it's really freeing, because if you ask that question and you realize, okay, they're making a mistake, you could just point them to somebody who does know philosophy and who has articulated it. And you don't have to know anything. You just have to know what resources to plug it into, right?
Absolutely. And it sets it up for future conversations. You don't have to be so nervous, to ask somebody. Somebody says, they're an atheist, they're a skeptic. Just say, hey, ask some questions. Well, why? When did you become that? What do you think is the best arguments, and what do you think is wrong with them? And then you kind of just, gather some information, and hey, maybe down the road when you have a second conversation, a third conversation, you point them to a resource, you can, just get to know what they've studied better. So it's part of what we're going to talk about today, because I kind of framed our essential question, as you said, like, what are the best arguments for God's existence? And I think it's a good way in when I teach high school math, as some people know, have heard my story, but we come up with like an essential question for the unit. And we talk about all these things. It's an overarching question. So our essential question for today, what are the best arguments? And I think one of the things we're going to start talking about, and don't worry, I'll give a list. I've got some bullet points here. I just took a few notes, but I'll take this conversation wherever you want it to go, is what do you mean by best? Because depending on the situation, that could have a lot to do with what the best argument is, but we can also look at the content. So I think we need to look at both the content of the argument, which could be judged by various criteria, but also like the purpose of giving the argument and the context, because the person that you're giving it to and the conversation that you're having is going to have a lot of bearing on what argument you present.
Yeah, that's very good. As you were talking about that, I was thinking, this is almost like us nerding out, like who's the best football player or something. Well, when you say best, what do you mean? The best when they're in the red zone, or the best overall stats. You're right. I mean, it's each argument kind of has its own strengths and weaknesses depending on the situation that comes up.
Yeah, and let me make a few more preliminary points, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of some of the arguments, because I like what you said there. Actually reminded me of something, because as you were just saying, some people are like, oh, I can't learn this philosophy stuff. I can't learn all these facts, about Jesus, about the church and such. But then they'll go out with their buddies and they're citing stats from wide receivers in the 1990s. They're talking about where that pitch was in the 8th inning of Game 7 in the 2004, ALCS and stuff like that. They know all these facts about all these different things. I'm convinced that, everybody, if they want to learn some of this evidence, that's what my podcast is about. That's what Hands-On Apologetics is about. We can get it out there to you. And a lot of people just need to know that, hey, there's this stuff out there and you can learn it. But if you can learn all these sports facts, all these music facts, I talk to people, they're passionate about stuff. They know stuff about things they're interested in. They could do the same with philosophy. But a couple other preliminaries before we talk about, what are the best arguments. I said I kind of break it down into the content of the argument and then the purpose or context of the argument. So with content, we're talking about like objective criteria like soundness. With an argument, we say it's sound when the premises are true, when they're well supported, and when the conclusion logically follows from the premises. So you can look at the soundness. Now, people might also want to look at the subjective criteria, things like how are people persuaded? How well do they find, the rhetorical devices in such an argument? Do they, find it convincing? But I would make a point that Pope Benedict made is that a good argument is not to be judged by the number of people it convinces or fails to convince. It should be judged on the objective criteria, and truth is not determined by head count. So there's the content as what the argument is saying. And then the second thing, and I'll just mention this point, is the purpose or context. We're concerned with hands-on apologetics. That's the name of your show, okay? Hands-on apologetics happens with individual conversations or groups with individual people who have their own background knowledge, stories, and so forth. So if you're talking to an atheist or a skeptic, you got to see what they've studied. If the person is a graduate level philosophy student, they're going to have a more sophisticated grasp on the arguments. If they're just a man on the street, like we said before, who was persuaded by the new atheist, they may haven't heard anything. Maybe they just think science is really good. Maybe they have a science background and they're more interested in the scientific evidence. So because hands-on apologetics takes place in individual conversations with real flesh and blood people who are made in the image of God, I think we got to do some work to figure out who we're talking to before we start rolling out the argument. So I think that's going to be very important for context and purpose. And then when we're ready, we can get into our lists or what we think is most powerful. And I just came up with 4 bullet point categories, and we can go into as much of the detail as you'd like. But I listed out metaphysical demonstrations. I listed out William Lane Craig's arguments, in particular the Kalam argument and the fine-tuning argument. Also, there's something known as epistemological arguments, or arguments from reason, consciousness, philosophy of mind. And then fourth, I also put on the list Pascal's wager and Dr. Michael Rota's recent update of that and how he lowers the bar for natural theology. So those are some categories that we can dive into. But before we do that, I just wanted to make that distinction between the content of the argument and then the purpose or the context.
Yeah, very good. Absolutely. Because, it's one thing that I repeat here on the show. It's kind of like we're part of a MASH unit. You remember the old program? Well, you don't. You're too young, probably.
I've heard of it.
Older people. Yeah, okay. It's the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. We're there to basically patch people up and direct them to the hospital, which is the church. And the first thing you do, any doctor, is you diagnose the problem before you start treating it. So great advice. I hear the music coming up. We're chatting with Master Apologist John DeRosa on what's the best arguments for the existence of God. Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back.
Welcome, Daniel. You're on the line. What's on your mind, brother?
Hi, I just wanted to share a testimony about Virgin Most Powerful Radio. I had a buddy at work who, he's a lukewarm Catholic guy, and I wanted him to start listening to the Terry and Jesse show, so I kept telling him to download the app, and he kept putting me off. So one day, I grabbed his phone, and I downloaded the app for him. I went on vacation, and I kept telling him to listen to it. He was kind of put me off. I came back from vacation. He comes to my cubicle, and he says to me, "Hey, man, I've been listening to the Terry and Jesse show, and it's great." And it's made a big impact in his life. The guy, he's going to weekly adoration a couple times a week. He goes to the Mass in the mornings. And, he's an on-fire Catholic, and he promotes the Terry and Jesse show on the Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Wow. Daniel, what a testimony. And I want to encourage our listeners to get those cards by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org and do what Daniel's doing. Go out and spread the faith by inviting people to listen to Virgin Most Powerful. Daniel, thanks for your testimony, brother. God love you.
You're welcome.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Master Apologist John DeRosa on what's the best arguments for the existence of God. And John just laid down, you have to look at content, how solid it is, and the other ones, I guess, usefulness, utility. I don't know, John.
Yeah, I put purpose and context is the words I use. Yeah, because it depends where you're using the argument and what your purpose is in the conversation with the individual.
Very good. And we mentioned that there's more than one. It's funny. Like I said, often as an apologist, I feel like I'm a pharmacist who is constantly giving prescriptions to people, and not every drug is perfect in every situation. And when it comes to arguments for the existence of God, there is a wide variety of different kinds of arguments. And John, right before the break, you mentioned the metaphysical demonstrations, the Clom and fine-tuning argument, the arguments from reason and Pascal's wager. And I was thinking, boy, if I was listening, I'd probably tune out, because as soon as you use those big words, I wouldn't have a clue what you meant by them. So it's kind of like inside speak. So, before we begin, why don't we just give general definitions? Like, what do you mean when you talk about metaphysical demonstrations for the existence of God?
Absolutely. And I just want to say, like you said, I love the pharmacist analogy. Apologetics, we draw on so many disciplines, philosophy, history, science, and so forth, that, there's a lot to learn, and no one person can learn it all. So don't be turned off by the fact that there's a lot of arguments. Be happy about that. That's something to, praise God that He gave us this world where there's so many different evidences that point to His existence. And as someone I would give different advice for different folks. I'm sure you have people who listen to your show who are very advanced, but the people just starting out, don't be turned off by the fact that there's so many arguments. Instead, here's what I would advise you: pick one or two. And then I like the acronym FOCUS. I got this from someone. It stands for follow one course until success. So pick one or two arguments and pour your energy into learning them for a week, for 2 weeks, for a month. And then as you know the key premises and the key objections that people make, you'll be able to give them more effectively in conversation. All right, let's go to that first category, though, metaphysical demonstrations. And at the First Vatican Council, the Church declared that the existence of God could be demonstrated with certainty from reason alone. And let me hash this out a bit, because people often misunderstand these terms. When I say demonstrated with certainty, we're referring to demonstrations that provide metaphysical certainty. And metaphysics is the philosophical study of being, of the fundamental realities that exist and the principles that underlies all of reality at its fundamental layer. And various metaphysical principles can have a secure certainty that's more firm than what's found in the natural sciences. These are things like whatever is being changed by something else. That's a typical principle of causality. Or the ability to produce an effect is to be found some way in its total cause. That's the principle of proportionate causality. Or everything that exists has a sufficient reason for its existence. That's the principle of sufficient reason. Now, these can sound very complicated, but I just want to point out these are things that can be true no matter what the physical facts turn out to be. If we found that a certain element, had more or less electrons than we thought, or if we discover whole new elements on the periodic table, it's not going to affect those underlying metaphysical principles about being itself, that whatever's being changed is being changed by something else. For example, so although the church says, and then one other clarification, although they say it can be demonstrated with demonstrated with certainty, the church hasn't pointed to any specific arguments that do the job. Now, I think she has in mind the metaphysical demonstrations like Aquinas' 5 ways. but they're not named in the church teaching. So people are definitely free to explore all the arguments and marshal the best evidence for God. And the final thing I'll say is metaphysical certainty is not to be confused with psychological certitude. So, some people might get really bogged down with the phrase certainty, and they really don't like it because someone might hold that the arguments succeed, like they think they work, they think they're decisive, yet they don't have what modern philosophers mean by like a psychological, incorrigible, unassailable certainty. Like maybe they don't have that in their mind, but they still think the arguments work. And so metaphysical certainty is about, the objective criteria that the arguments work independently of whatever the scientific facts turn out to be. So personally, I think the metaphysical demonstrations, these are things that stem from principles of being. I think those are going to be the very strong arguments for God's existence. And these are things like the first way of St. Thomas Aquinas, the third way of St. Thomas Aquinas. I like those two in particular. Also, the contingency argument developed by Leibniz. And with these arguments, they have a stage 1 and a stage 2 aspect. Stage 1 will get you to something, an uncaused cause, an unmoved mover, an absolutely necessary being. And then in stage 2, you'll kind of cash out some attributes or what this cause or necessary being has to be like. And from that, you'll conclude that it has the divine attributes and must be God. So if you'd like, we could take a look at some more detail of those metaphysical demonstrations. But when you hear that word, metaphysical means it's about the study of being, philosophy of being, and then demonstration just means it's a good argument that proceeds from truthful premises that follow from one another to a conclusion.
Yeah, very good. Well, why don't we just give the overview of them, and then we could dive in maybe and focus on one or two that you particularly like. Yeah.
So, do you want me to give you the other categories, or do you want me to talk more about the first way and third way now?
No, let's hold off on that. Let's talk about clom and fine tuning.
Oh yeah, sure. Okay, absolutely, yeah.
Because I know a lot of people are like, categories. What's a clom? Is that like a kilometer or?
That was a great question, and the more you look into this stuff, you'll learn the words and you'll pick up on it definitely quickly. Yeah. But I think anyone who's watched a debate with Dr. William Lane Craig has seen that he has ably defended these arguments. The Kalam cosmological argument going back, about 30 years or more. The fine-tuning argument he's done very well with. The moral argument he's also defended well. But what I would say is that these classes of arguments are almost easiest to present as inductive arguments in the sense that they point to something and then we say that God is the best explanation of what they're pointing to. So, for example, the Kalam cosmological argument, which goes back to Al-Ghazali and Muslim philosophers in medieval times, right before Aquinas, and some were contemporary with Aquinas, they argue from the beginning of the universe. Well, the argument goes like this, very simple to state in 3 premises. Actually, and by the way, this is one I suggest using a conversation because the Kalam argument is very easy to memorize and present. So if you want to explore something, for the next couple of weeks, Kalam's not a bad place to start. It says this. Okay. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And we can defend those premises. If you want to get into more detail, we can. But then from that, we would think about what the cause must be like. And we would say the best explanation is that the cause is God. It's not as airtight as the logic of Aquinas and Leibniz, who get from their necessary being to deducing the divine attributes, but it's still a great argument, or Brandon Vaught uses the term signpost that points to God. So I like it for that reason. Same thing with fine-tuning. We take an aspect of the universe, such as in the fine-tuning, this really comes from like physics over the past 50, 60 years. They've noticed that these constants and quantities in the universe fall into an exceedingly small, exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. That if, something like the gravitational constant, and there's a bunch of these different constants, if it were altered ever so slightly, it would not be possible for life to exist in any form. We're not just talking about humans. We're talking about regular, basic, run-of-the-mill life. In some of these scenarios, if you alter it slightly, you wouldn't even have the periodic table of elements. You wouldn't even be able to do chemistry, as Dr. Craig argues. So because we have these really tiny life-permitting ranges, and we happen to fall into those, we can ask what best explains that. Is it best explained by chance? Is it best explained by physical necessity, like it just had to be that way? Or is it best explained by an intelligent designer? And I think Dr. Craig does a nice job, and I can give you some more details going into that, defending the fine-tuning argument as well. So there's Kalam and fine-tuning, best explanation, or they point to something in the universe, such as the beginning of the universe or the fine-tuning of the constants and quantities, and then they argue that the best explanation of that phenomenon is that God exists. And I think they're pretty strong.
Yeah, very good. Yeah,
there's final two. Do you want to go into the final two categories?
Yeah, why don't we do that? Next would be arguments from reason.
Yeah, this is, I don't know if it deserves its own category, but it goes back to Chapter 3 of Miracles, written by C.S. Lewis, though other people have addressed the argument before that and expanded upon it. But he basically argues that reason itself, the fact that human beings have this rational faculty and can think and deduce conclusions, premise, conclusion, the fact that we can do that needs to be explained. And he argues that if naturalism is true, or if atheism is true, or atheistic materialism, if it's true, then we have no reason to trust our reason. Our reason itself must transcend the physical facts about the universe in order for it to be valid, in order for us to think that it works. And this creates a problem for atheism and naturalism in this argument from reason, because if naturalism is true, it turns out it undercuts itself, and they're left with no reason to think that naturalism is true. And I have a good analogy I can give for that illustration. But then the last one I'll just mention, and we can go back to that if you want, argument from reason. It's tough because you got to get into some philosophy of mind. You got to get into some nitty-gritty details to make it really work in its fullest force. But it's a really cool argument that C.S. Lewis and others have developed. And then the last thing I'll mention, I think this should undergird our entire presentation, is Pascal's wager updated by Dr. Michael Roda, because he argues very convincingly in his book, Taking Pascal's Wager, that if Christianity has even around a 50% chance of being true, then someone should commit to living a devout Christian life. Because there are, the greatest good would be to be in union with our Creator. The greatest bad would be to be separated for forever. And even if it weren't true, then, the gains that you're going to have in this life are relatively small. And also the goods that come with living a religious life, there's sociological data that say the goods that come with that are also beneficial. Because of all of those reasons, you should commit to trying to live a Christian life, and your life will be better. So he kind of lowers the bar for natural theology, and I could talk more about that on the other side of the break.
All right, very good. We're chatting with Master Apologist John DeRosa on what's the best arguments for the existence of God. Stay tuned, everybody.
We have an exciting story for you to listen to. The story of John Pridmore. John Pridmore was a hitman for the gangs in East London.
I met some guys who seemed to have everything that I thought would make you happy. So I started working for these people. So to my shame, I was involved in vicious crime of all sorts.
He collected debts for the gangs, and if people didn't pay their debts, it was his job to kill them.
And as I drove home that night, I thought, what have I become that I could kill someone and not even care?
He was in the elevator on his way up to the 17th floor, and there was a 17-year-old young man in the elevator with him. Suddenly, this young man looked John right in the eye, and he said, "Jesus loves you."
And I said the first prayer I'd ever said. I said, up to now, all I've done is take from you, God. Now I want to give.
Within a year, by the grace of God, John was able to get out of the gang and be freed from this road to hell that he had been walking on. Go to Virgin Most Powerful YouTube channel and listen to this story today.
In Luke 7, Jesus said, "I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven her, because she has been shown great love." According to St. John of the Cross, Christians should always remember that the value of their good works is not based on number and excellence. Their value is based on the love for God that prompts them to do the works. May we always be motivated by true love for God and not worry so much about what we do, but why we do it.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Well, my good friend John DeRosa and I are nerding out on the proofs for the existence of God and having a ton of fun. And John has just given a great explanation of, I guess you could kind of say, leagues of arguments, since we're using that sports analogy, metaphysical demonstrations, the Kalam, fine-tuning arguments from reason. And John, right before the break, you were basically explaining Pascal's wager.
Yes, and I just to tie that up in a nice bow, I wanted to say, again, Dr. Michael Rhoda, he's been on my show, he's done a lot of great work on this. He couches it as a way of lowering the bar for natural theology. And that's the case because if you can believe, okay, maybe you're not convinced 100%. Maybe you're not persuaded that these arguments are decisive. Maybe you need to study them more. And I think some of them are definitely decisive. But perhaps the person you're talking to thinks there might be something there, but they're not going all the way to granting that God exists. Rhoda says, in that case, the person, they shouldn't force themselves to believe, because Pascal's wager goes back to Blaise Pascal in the 17th century, a mathematician, and it gets a bad rap because there's some standard objections like, oh, you can't force yourself to believe something you don't really believe, or, well, how do you know, that some other religion isn't true? And Rhoda deals with all of those objections, but the basic reframing of it he does is in terms of not belief, but commitment. And he says, maybe you think there's around a 50-50 chance that God exists. In that case, commit to living a Christian life, maybe for a month, maybe for a year. In other words, say the prayers. They can be conditional. God, if you exist, help me to know this. Help me to see who you are. Try to go out of your way to do acts of charity. Try to talk to other people who have a prayer life and develop it, and just commit to doing that. And I believe Christ when he says that, when we knock, or when we stand outside and knock at the door, he will open it. And when he knocks at our heart, these people, even if they have a little bit of grace, they're not sure that God exists. I believe as a Catholic, God gives sufficient grace to all men to be saved. And by putting that effort out there, that commitment, they may not start with a firm belief that God exists, but they may end up there, after some time of searching and thinking about God. So what Rhoda's idea is lowering the bar of entry point. No, you don't have to think these arguments work 100%, but just enough. Our natural theology can definitely give people enough to think that there's something there. And if there's something there, even as little as a 50-50 chance, then you should pursue God because he's worth it. So that's the new idea of Pascal's wager.
Oh, that's neat. All right. So, you did a masterful job, by the way, breaking down these categories, because, just the categories themselves can be, sound intimidating. Okay, so the way I look at it, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, so metaphysical demonstrations and probably the arguments from reason, those would be the more hardcore, more definitive ways of demonstrating existence, where the Kalam fine-tuning and Pascal's wager would be more like suasions. It points towards it, but it might persuade people, but they in themselves don't demonstrate it metaphysically. Is that correct?
I think, that's actually a good division there. And honestly, I just when I was drawing up this list, I was thinking of different ways to do it. So it's helpful to get your feedback on that. But that makes sense to me. I do think the metaphysical demonstrations, like the 5 ways of Aquinas and the Leibniz's argument, and the argument from reason, if those work, then they work very decisively, and that deductive inference is airtight. Whereas the Kalam, fine-tuning, other arguments you could throw on the table are more like signposts or clues that point in the direction of God, even if they don't give us as decisive certainty.
Yeah, very good. Okay, well, why don't we do this? I'll give you some situations that a person could be in, and maybe you can pull out just, mention a couple of arguments that they could either point to or give themselves.
That's great.
That would
okay. Let's do it.
Okay. Well, let's assume that we meet somebody who is a good time friend, who is very studious and is a convinced atheist, and he wants proof. He doesn't, he won't settle for anything less than that. Where would you go? What arguments would you pull out of your bag?
Yeah, that's a good question. If they are a settled, convinced atheist, they've studied for a while, and if they're a good friend of mine, it means I've probably talked to them, so I'd have some more knowledge of what they've studied. But I would probably go to one of the metaphysical demonstrations and hear their thoughts on it, because a lot of people will dismiss them with crude objections that came from Immanuel Kant or David Hume or other people like Richard Dawkins, and they haven't really engaged. Even if they're a serious atheist, they may not have engaged with the strongest. So let's talk, for example, the third way of St. Thomas Aquinas. I think that's a nice way to start. I think Dr. Delfino, who we've had on the show, does a nice job of defending this. But here's how I might lay it out in conversation with this atheist. I might say, hey, let me talk to you about this argument from St. Thomas Aquinas. What do you think about this? St. Thomas says there are that possible beings exist versus necessary beings. And so first, let's just think about the idea of a possible being. Would you agree with me that there's things that exist that didn't have to exist? And what Aquinas means by possible being is just things that go into being and come out of being. For example, myself or yourself, Gary Machuda, we both had a beginning. We will die one day. We're mortal human beings, but we didn't have to exist. If our parents never met, if something were different in the past, then we would never have came about. This idea of coming into being and going out of being is what Aquinas means by a possible being. What do you think about that term? And I'd make sure they're clear on what I mean by that first, because defining your terms is important when you're going with a philosophical argument.
Absolutely.
Next step. All right, you grant that, let's say they grant that possible beings exist, because that's a really obvious fact. Oh, and one other thing I forgot to say before, because we'll just go into some detail with the third way, and then at the end I can point people to more things if they're interested. But I lost my train of thought with the possible being, necessary being. Let me just go to the next thing, and maybe I'll think of it. But with this argument next, you want to point out that if something is I just remembered. Sorry, I just remembered what I was going to say. Sorry about that. See, when you got all these arguments on the table, your head, I'm going a mile a minute. But what I was going to say was that you need to point out that these metaphysical demonstrations start with basic experience level phenomenon. They don't start with weird, kooky phenomena. And you'll notice listeners might be wondering, I haven't mentioned miracles today. And I probably should have included that as another separate category, miracles. But when we're talking about the philosophical arguments, we're not even going there. We're just talking about basic experience level phenomenon that anybody can rationally affirm, such as there are possible beings. There's things that come into being and go out of being. Okay, so next step in the third way, and I'm borrowing this from Delfino, if there are things as possible beings, we need to judge that possible beings point outside of themselves to a cause of their existence. By the very fact that they're possible, that they come into being and go out of being, they can't be the cause of their own existence because that would be a contradiction. So they point outside to something else. That's the next principle in the argument. And you might have to say, hey, what do you think about that? You might discuss that back and forth. I'm condensing it for space here, but these are all good things to go to in a conversation.
Right.
After that, next question. And sorry, I'm kind of cutting you off, Gary, but feel free to cut in if you want to ask a question. I'm just going to give the final step, and then you can pose a follow-up if you need to. But
go ahead.
Possible being points outside of itself for its cause or for the reason for its existence. Then you have to ask the all-important question. Could the entire world be made up of only possible beings? Could only possible beings exist? And the way Delfino does it, he says, just think, could there be a world with just one possible being at first? And the answer would be no, because if there's just one possible being and it points outside of itself, well, what's it pointing outside of itself to if it's the only thing that exists? That doesn't make any sense. But then you could say, is everything a possible being? And what you find out is, well, a possible being can point outside of itself to another possible being, can point outside of itself to another possible being. But if there's nothing else, if there's only possible beings, what you end up with an infinite regress or a hierarchical causal chain, which is held up by nothing. And here's where I would give an analogy to these possible beings and possible beings. The classic one is links in a chain going up to the ceiling. If you have a chandelier that's held by a chain, and then there's another chain link and another chain link holding up that one, and another chain link holding up that one, if you have an infinite number of chain links going up to the ceiling, but the chandelier is never actually embedded into anything, it's just hanging there in midair, well, there's no explanation for why it's held up. In a similar way, if you only have possible beings explained by possible beings, explained by possible beings, but nothing else further, it turns out the existence of any possible being, including the ones that we, experience now, ourselves, different things that come into being, could never exist. So what we do is we stop the infinite regress by saying there must be some other type of being, namely the other type that's not a possible being is a necessary being. So you say there must be at least one necessary being that stands outside the realm of causes. And then you would discuss that conclusion for a bit. And you make a further distinction between beings that are necessary through themselves or necessary through another. And there's some more discussion to be had. But eventually, with this third way, you can work your way back to there has to be one absolutely necessary being that's necessary through itself. And it turns out it can't be material. It can't be changeable. It has to be eternal, and it possesses a whole host of divine attributes. So I know I kind of rushed that a little bit at the end with a little bit of the sketch, but that's probably where I'd start with the third way of Aquinas.
Oh, that's beautiful. Excellent. Okay, we have, if you could do this in like 3 minutes or so, you'll win the award, which is, I don't know, I'll have to come up with the award. How about this scenario? You have a friend who is a practical atheist. They don't even know if God exists or not really care whether God exists or not, kind of wondering why you're making such a big deal about God's existence. Where would you go for somebody like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's definitely really common. I think I would start by asking that person about questions related to meaning and purpose. So I know I'm not pulling out an argument right away, but I think when people might live a practical atheism because they think God doesn't matter, but when you start asking them questions about meaning and purpose, like, hey, if you died tomorrow, let's say, what would you regret not doing? Or what are some of the things you're hoping for in the future? Find out what they really care about, because yes, people can have apathy, but I think the apathy often stems from the fact that they are just in a world where most people don't, or a lot of people in their own circles maybe don't seem to care about God. They don't think there's good evidence, and so they've just become apathetic over the years. But I would start with questions about meaning, such as the one I just asked. Like, hey, if you were to die next week, what would you regret not doing? Get to the core of their convictions. Another route, we didn't talk much about the moral argument today, but most people...
You know what, John? I'm hearing the music, believe it or not.
Oh, Gary,
I'm so sorry.
I ran out of time, but classicaltheism.com if people want to find out more about these arguments. And I'm so sorry I ran out of time. We'll definitely have to come back to discuss more of these in detail.
All right. Yeah, no, it's entirely my fault. But anyway, John DeRosa, yes, go to classicaltheism.com. Great stuff. Lots of great information, as you can tell from John. Coming up next, High Impact Catholic Talk coming in here with the Terry and Jesse Show. And tomorrow we're going to have a good friend, Dr. Douglas Beaumont, come on and answer the question, can a man become God? There's a question for you. Well, it's time for me to shut down the Midwest Command Center, turn off the dojo lights. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. And God willing, we'll talk again soon.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.